I am Angela, and today I'm going to be talking about some of my favorite books from 2019. This is actually going to be the first of two videos. The second video will probably come out on next Monday, and this is not going to be in order of how much I liked them or anything like that. This is just 10 books I read this past year that I really wanted to talk about for a couple of minutes in the order that I read them. So the first book that I read in 2019 that I'd like to talk about is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. She's actually probably better known for Circe, which was her second novel and is a retelling of the Odyssey. This is a retelling of the Iliad from the perspective of Patroclus, who's basically Achilles' person. It was her debut novel, and I actually liked this one even more than Circe, which I really liked Circe, so that's saying something. It's a beautiful love story. It's also just a really interesting retelling and examination of masculinity. In the Iliad, Patroclus is most often described as being gentle. That is like the most common adjective associated with him, or like his most common epithet. And that is something that Miller talked about being really interested in examining, and I think that she does a really great job of it. It's such an interesting perspective to choose for what is one of like the most famous war stories in Western canon, and it's just a really beautiful, really sweet and interesting book. It made me like Achilles, which I didn't think was possible, and also the cover is just very gorgeous and shiny. And yeah, I think about this book all the time. I loved it. It was also, I think I read it in like maybe 2 sittings. I just cannot say enough lovely things about this book. The second book I wanted to talk about today was The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell. This is probably the oldest book on the list. It was written in 1996, and it's science fiction. It's set in 2016-ish and then in 2059, so it's actually one of those fun old science fiction books where now our past is their future, which I always really enjoy. So in 2016, Earth finds out that there is sentient life on another planet, or at least we think that there is, and the first people to send a mission to explore that are actually the Catholic Church. So it's basically a first contact story about Jesuits. There's a lot of interesting conversations about faith and different people's relationship to both this work of going and exploring this new planet and also their own relationships with God. There's obviously a lot of Jesuits in it. There's also some agnostic and a Jewish perspective, and everyone's relationship to faith sort of shifts over the course of the book as things happen. Also a book that parallels in a lot of ways Europe's exploration of the Americas and does a really good job of talking about sort of the stakes and the isolation involved in that kind of extreme early exploration. It's also, of course, happening in a world that carries the legacy of European contact with the Americas and sort of the colonialism and all of the stuff that came afterwards. So it's also in many ways a story about what does space exploration look like given sort of the baggage and history that we as a species bring to it. And then I can't really speak to any of the science bits in it, but they were really cool to me. The aliens in this are very cool aliens, and I still think about them a lot. Also, it's so beautiful. This is the 20th anniversary edition, and it's just gorgeous. The next book I want to talk about is Factionist 10 Reasons We're Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think, which is by Hans Rosling in collaboration with his son and daughter-in-law. This is a book that got a lot of hype. It's blurbed by Bill Gates. Obama talked about it, and it's basically looking at global trends and data as well as our conceptions and misconceptions of what the world looks like. So how many people there are, how educated are those people, how much access to wealth do they have, how have those things changed over time. It does a really good job of recontextualizing global poverty and helping people from wealthier nations like the United States or Sweden, where the author is from, understand the differences between what it's like to live on $2 a day versus $8 a day, which from the perspective of someone in like the United States, those seem like very similar amounts of money, but in reality, for people for whom that is like their life, it looks hugely different. So it's a lot of like sort of unpacking those kinds of things and looking at how many people on this planet have access to different amounts of wealth and resources and all of those things. It also uses really great visuals. The first place that I actually encountered any of the author's work was in his TED Talk a few years ago, which blew up, which was basically like these shifting graphs showing the populations of each country and then their income versus life expectancy. And then there's also like graphs showing like where do all the people in the world live and how's that likely to change over time? And it just does a really good job of sort of examining what do we think is true about the world, and then like what do the numbers actually say, and how do those things shift. Highly recommend this book. There's a good chance that now that it's in front of me, I'm gonna read it again. What I wanted to talk about was Let's Talk About Love by Claire Kahn, which is a YA romance novel. It took me a little bit of time to get into, but I think that's mostly because those are not really genres that I read very much. But I loved it so much. It's very sweet. It is the story of this girl called Alice, who is, I believe, a college freshman. And at the end of the year, her girlfriend breaks up with her because she's asexual. And so then she swears off love. She's just gonna go work at this library and hang out with her friends. But then, of course, a very cute boy also starts working at the library, and so things unfold from there. I really loved the romance plot in this. It very much felt like a story that allowed Alice to be sort of both at peace with her sexual orientation and also in conversation with it. Oftentimes when I read protagonists that are ace or characters that are ace, it feels either like they're having to give up some part of their orientation or like they're having to make compromises. And while sort of the love story in this is a little bit uncertain, it also still feels like that romance fantasy for like ace people, which I haven't seen a lot of and I really enjoyed, and also it's just a lot of fun and really sweet. Alice also navigates like lots of things with like her family and talking about like what she wants to major in and what she wants to do. I loved this one. I highly recommend it. And then the last book I wanted to talk about, I don't have a copy of because I actually listened to it on audiobook, but it's one that definitely, if you live in the United States, you've heard about a lot, which is Becoming by Michelle Obama. A couple of things that really stood out to me in this book are that Michelle Obama talks a lot about sort of navigating and creating a career that was meaningful to her. She's obviously super high achieving. She goes to Princeton and then to Harvard Law, and becomes like a fancy big shot lawyer in Chicago, and then realizes that she hates being a fancy big shot lawyer in Chicago. And so a lot of it is her navigating like should she create a new meaningful career for herself, and what does that look like when she's also a Black woman and has a bunch of student loan debt, and sort of navigating all of those different things. It also is a really great book about like family and both her childhood growing up in like a period of like white flight and extreme change in Chicago, and then also talking about things like disability and work-life balance. It's one of the most honest and thoughtful portrayals I think I've seen of what it is like to be an ambitious, high-achieving woman and mother that also has a partner that is obviously hugely ambitious and high-achieving, and she just has really honest conversations about like what does that kind of marriage look like, that I found fascinating. Obviously, all the things about being the first lady, both the first Black first lady and then just life in the White House generally, are really fascinating. And she also talks about her experience dating Barack, which was highly entertaining. I really enjoyed it. The audiobook in particular, I love listening to people read their own memoirs, and this one definitely holds up. And it was one that, again, you don't need me to tell you that Becoming exists, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. So that is it for sort of the first half of my year. I will come back and talk about the second half shortly. Please let me know sort of some of your favorite books of the year down in the comments. And thank you so much. It felt actually true to, the romance was really sweet and really well done. It felt very one take.